and welcome to another edition of Health Solutions with Shawn and Janet Needham, where Team Needham discusses everything healthcare. I am your host, Shawn Needham, and I'm with my producer, Lindsay, today, and we are in wonderful downtown Bend, Oregon, streaming live. And today we have Terra Thomas. She is a type 1 diabetic. She is a health coach. She is an advocate, and she is going to tell us today about how she helps diabetics control their disease. And you do not want to miss it, because she has some really, being a type 1 diabetic herself and being a competitive athlete, she has some great ways and great avenues to complement the traditional healthcare system with people and show people how to control their diabetes. So you do not want to miss it. Stay for the entire show. As always, you can catch us on my personal Facebook page and the Moses Lake Professional Pharmacy YouTube site every Monday, 1 to 2 p.m. and our midweek podcast every Thursday, usually 8 to 9 a.m. We stream live. So do not miss that. Also on all the podcast forums. So iHeart, iTunes, Spotify, SoundCloud, so on. Go to those podcast forums and follow us, like us, listen, thank you, and comment. Let us know what else you'd like to hear. YouTube, don't forget about YouTube. Moses Lake Professional Pharmacy YouTube. Subscribe to our YouTube site. You do not want to miss an episode. Subscribe to our YouTube site. There's a lot of good videos on there. So with that, I am going to actually introduce Terra, and I'm going to let her introduce herself a little bit too. She'll tell us how long she's had diabetes and been conquering diabetes, and just rocking it. It's an amazing story. I learned a lot just from talking to her a few weeks ago, and I'm going to learn a lot today from the podcast too. And that's one thing that's great about this podcast. I get to meet people like Terra from all over the country and learn so much from them. So I really appreciate Terra being on, and I really appreciate our listeners and viewers for listening and watching. So Terra, without any more, I'm going to let you introduce yourself. Terra, welcome to our show.
Well, good morning. Thank you for having me. I've been living with type 1 diabetes since 1990, so for 30 years. And I was diagnosed in high school as a runner at the time, and that's really been something that served me throughout my life living with diabetes. And now I'm really fortunate. I am a health coach, and some of my clients are people who live with diabetes and families. So I get really excited when I get to work with those clients.
So let's just back up a little bit to 1990. So you're in high school. How old are you in high school when you were diagnosed?
I was 17.
Okay. So tell me how you felt that day that you got diagnosed, and kind of what some of your symptoms were that made you go into to seek care. That what kind of symptoms you were experiencing to make you seek care that you might have diabetes or something.
Well, I went to a high school. I grew up in Spokane, Washington. I went to Meade High School, and we had a phenomenal running program. And when I was diagnosed, I was a junior. And in my sophomore year, we had won state. And so that kind of themed my life. My running was a big, big part of my life. So in March 1990, when I was diagnosed, I was about a month into getting into track season, which as an athlete in high school, a runner, that's when colleges look at you as your junior year of your track season, because by your senior year, it's too late. You've already decided where you're going to go. And so I had trained all winter, running, getting up in the morning and going to the gym, running with the JV boys after school. And I was starting to notice I was getting up a lot at night to go to the bathroom. And my coach advocated us filling out a log. And I was noticing I was starting to keep track of 6 times a night I was going to the bathroom.
Whoa.
And for me in high school, what's going on? And mono was something that goes around a lot in high school. So I was like, maybe I have mono. And I remember I'd go to the gym and I'd sit in the hot tub, and I was losing a lot of weight, and which isn't a big bother for a 17-year-old girl runner. Right. You think I'm getting lean. And then I just wasn't feeling good. So I had my mother take me to the hospital, and we're sitting in the waiting room, and she's like, I just hope you don't have diabetes. And I was like, well, that's definitely not going to happen, because 1, I've never heard the word before, and 2, it sounds really serious, whatever it is. And then we go back into the room, and the nurse said to me, we have good news and we have bad news. The good news is we know what it is. which now at 48 I can appreciate, but at 17 I was like, how is that good news? And then she's like, you have type 1 diabetes. And due to my blood sugar levels and the circumstance, I lived with my father. My parents were divorced. They put me in the hospital for the next 4 days.
And so when did you decide? So, you get a serious diagnosis like that. And I know probably all of us that are listening or watching, I know personally I can, attest to, having a nephew that was diagnosed when he was, I think, 12 or 13, and kind of the same situation. He was getting up a lot at night to urinate. And, my brother was kind of asking me, some questions. And of course I knew that his mom was a gestational diabetic. So she had some glucose meters there, or a glucose meter with some blood sugar testing supplies. Anyway, same situation. He tested his blood sugar, and sure enough. So, but one of the things is I think there comes a time. What made you, when you initially got that diagnosis? First of all, I got to back up a little bit. Does your mom have healthcare background?
No. My mom was my health advocate from a young age, and that, no, she does not. She's a stay-at-home mom.
How did she, good for her, how did she guess that it might be diabetes before the diagnosis came back?
I do not know the answer to that question. Unfortunately, she passed 7 years ago, because it was not on her side of the family. On my father's side of the family, I come to learn there was a grandmother who had type 1, so maybe she was aware of it existing on my father's side. I'm not certain.
Okay. So when you initially got that diagnosis, when did you decide? How long was it you decided that you're gonna conquer this disease, and you're not gonna let it conquer you? How soon did you decide that?
It's an interesting question. I feel really fortunate. My experiences I brought to when I had my diagnosis, I've never really had the perspective that I was conquering or fighting anything. I just knew what I wanted in my life, and I figured out how to navigate within the parameters of my disease to figure that out. So I knew running was important. To me, it was my community, it was my mental health, it was my physical activity, and that was my first question for my doctor. Unfortunately, at that time, back in Spokane in 1990, there wasn't the internet, and my doctor was advocating me. I think he said something along the lines of, maybe you can get out 3 times a week and walk. And I just felt so dissociated from my healthcare team because I was working out intensively 3 times a day. And so I just didn't feel I had anyone on my team that had knowledge around how to live the life I wanted to live and how to do it while living with diabetes. So I just started exploring and gathering information and correcting as I needed to get to where I wanted to go. And that's kind of how I've always lived for 30 years with it.
Good for you. Good for you. And I'm glad that, you're inspiring other people, because I think, unfortunately, I think, and you can help us on this during this podcast, but I think in some ways our healthcare system's gotten a little bit better about that. And they've realized that there's some diabetics like you that, although your life changes, because it's just going to, you don't have to let it, completely control your life. And, if you wanted to be a competitive runner and you were a competitive runner and you still wanted to be, you still can. And I think, 30 years ago, it was a little bit different. It's like, kind of like you said, it's like, okay, walk 3 days a week. Well, honestly, walking 3 days a week for somebody like you that was running, every day, I just can't imagine that, being good for your physical health or mental health. Right. So, yeah. So now just continue that story to where, you get out of the ICU and, you're on insulin probably, and, go ahead and continue that story and just how you progressed for the last 30 years.
I just completed writing a daily blog about every year through, actually I haven't completed it on my last day to do. So it takes quite a while to travel. But what I will say is there's a lot of overwhelm that happens when you're initially diagnosed. There's so much information and the learning curve is so steep. And I will have people reach out to me that say, oh, I just had a friend's son who's diagnosed. Can I put him in contact with you? And the pattern that I've noticed are people are so overwhelmed with people want to shower them with resources they don't even know where to begin. And I really wasn't all that different, especially I wanted to run. I wanted to be with my friends. I wanted to be a 17-year-old. And so I wasn't in the ICU, just to be clear. I was just put in the hospital, and I remember the nurse brought in the orange, and I was like, what? I have to learn to do this? Like, you're not going to be next to me like a little shoulder on me. And, I have to learn to do this. So, and at 17, it's an interesting age. I feel very fortunate. My dad raised me to be autonomous and independent. And so I was already in that role in a lot of areas of my life. So diabetes wasn't different. My running changed. I didn't know how to return to be a competitive athlete. Pushing my limits changed. And so I just really had to modify to be able to continue to do what I was doing. I did continue to run. I did continue to compete, but I wasn't able to in my next years in high school and college to compete at the level that I was before my diagnosis. Luckily now people have the internet. They have role models that are achieving whatever goals people desire. I think that's fantastic. And I love working with youth for that exact reason. So I went away to college and continued to run and do school. And I just kept gathering more and more information. It's interesting. A few things you were saying was about, how do I control my diabetes? I let go of that a long time ago. I gather information with my diabetes. The more you try to think you have control, the more the disease speaks up to let you know. There's just so many variables that are contributing. Mm-hmm. I can get in an argument with someone and have a hormonal response due to some glucose, and that's going to impact very differently with my insulin than, let's say, a bagel. So I continue to gather information, and it's through the process of living with it for 30 years that I'm able to come to my decision making with what am I optimizing for? What do I know about this in the past? And where am I kind of guessing? And try to approach that without judgment and justifications as much as I can. But I went on to, through college, I found this love of adventure and outdoor activity. And it's always included a wide variety of activities in the outdoors. So I'm not, I could add so many stories and examples, but I want to.
We like stories, and we'll get into those a little bit later. We like stories. So tell us about the process. You mentioned in our pre-show call that, I think you said, doctors don't really go through the process with you, and they don't really spend the time with you. And this is more of a healthcare system issue. So you felt that when you were initially diagnosed, and I don't know, and you can even tell us about what's going on now with how you seek healthcare, but you say that, doctors don't really spend the time to go over your disease with you. Will you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think you need to be really clear about what your expectations are of your healthcare team and what you're expecting of them. I think doctors do a fantastic job with what they're trained for. They're trained to look at numbers, trends, make adjustments on insulin dosing. But diabetes is about gaining, people go in and see their doctor every 3 months or every 6 months or every year, and hopefully they're at least doing that so that they can get some feedback on adjusting. But ultimately, you need to learn how to interact with your circumstances day to day. There's nothing that lasts a week, let alone 3 months. So you're constantly making some modifications to your regimen. And unless you are trained and aware and know what you're doing and know how you're taking that, and doctors are doing what they're trained to do. They're not trained in nutrition, or if they are, it's very minimal. Right. And then the CDEs and the dietitians, they're there to educate you, and that's what they do. But what the system is lacking is asking a person, how do they define health? What are their goals for them? And then seeking out the information to complement what they desire. What tends to happen is people go into the healthcare with their healthcare team, with their doctors and their CDEs and their educators, and they're told what they need versus being asked what's important to them, and then creating a healthcare regimen around that.
So and that's one of the places where you come in as a health coach, correct?
Correct.
Because you help the patients do what they want. I think that I'm taking words out of your mouth on that, but tell us what that means to you and what that could mean to them, because obviously you want them to be in good health, but what do you mean by what they want?
I actually optimize to help work with them for what they desire. And if it comes to the surface that they desire something that's contradictory, we explore that. And I use my framework of health and different areas of wellness to explore with them. But I start off by meeting my clients where they are. And in order to do that, you need to get an experience with someone, and it's a process. So we talk about what's important to them, things that are challenging, where they're finding areas where there's struggle, and we explore that together. And then we look at, what is available to them as resources, and where they want to go. And then we create a plan. We do periodic assessments to look at where they're going. So with my clients, whether they have diabetes or they don't have diabetes, we're really looking at where are you right now? Where do you want to go? And then together creating that path and developing the tools and the skills to keep that, to get you there. To where you desire.
And I think obviously your experience, being a type 1 diabetic yourself helps a lot with that. And I think, being a pharmacist and being in the healthcare system, I realize that there are definitely a lot of gaps in our system when it comes to, just taking the time to educate people. And I think one of the issues is that when you talk about overall health, I think a lot of healthcare providers themselves are not healthy. And so it's nice to see a health coach like yourself that's also a type 1 diabetic that can, educate diabetics on, on just good health choices in general. Because really, whether you're diabetic or not, good healthcare choices are obviously, what diet and exercise are really important. It's just more important when you're diabetic, correct?
Well, I would disagree. I think it's important for everyone.
That's right. Good for you. I'm glad you said that.
I remember when I was diagnosed at 17, I was just over 100 pounds and I'm 5'8". So I was very, very lean. And I went in to a certified diabetes educator and sat in a room, and they were telling me what I needed to eat and how my meat portion needed to be the size of my hand. And as though if I was to eat more than that, there was something I was doing wrong. And I looked at this person, and at the time at 17, with the perspectives I held, they weighed well over 300 pounds. And I had this person in this role who did not appear, for what my 17-year-old mind held as health, appear as healthy to me. And they were trying to say, I know what is better for you. This is what it is. And then I had family members and people that I cared about in my life really starting to question what I was eating. Should you be having that? Can you have that? And people that were smoking, drinking. So I really started to say like what is health, and what should everyone be doing around health? And quite honestly, if you look at how someone should obtain help, that comes down to an individual. There are times, I think COVID's a great example, where people want to sit in their sweats and maybe have a few more glasses of wine. The life stressors, the overwhelm. I'm not saying that's healthy, but what I'm saying is what is important to them and what are their needs at the time. I'm not at all advocating. I want to be clear that I'm not advocating extra glasses of wine, but I have many girlfriends that this is how they are choosing to, deal with the situation that they have in front of them, the circumstance. So I think it's important, and this is what I do with my clients, is really working to empower them in their life around what they desire. And then it's dynamic. There's not one size fits all. I think we've all arrived there. We all know calories in, calories out isn't the framework. Some people do well on eating meat. Some people don't do well on eating meat. Some people do well on eating wheat. Some people don't do well on eating meat. So often people are like, take care of yourself first. It's remarkable how many of my clients have no idea how to do that because they've existed in a framework of people telling them what they need. They have no idea how to know what they need.
Well, and I think, people like yourself and myself included, because I've dealt with it a long time. I've struggled with weight myself, and I've had to lose weight, and I've counseled a lot of people on weight loss and healthy eating. And sometimes we just take things for granted. And so, there's certain things that we say or do that, we think is just, common knowledge, but, a lot of people, they need help with that. So, so it's great that you're out there and empowering individuals, and you're perfect for our podcast, because that's our goal on this podcast is to educate and empower individuals that they can control their own health.
Yeah. I mean,
So, go ahead.
You get clear about what is important to you, and it's really a path of least resistance. The momentum you gain to where you want to go and what you desire, because it's inspired effort, it's inspired action. And it's so easy for a company or a product to make you feel you want this certain thing, and it's a short-term thing, but it's really taking the step back and asking what do I value? What's important to me? When am I aligned in my life? When do I feel centered and grounded and kind of where I want to be? And that's not easy to get clear around.
No, that's for sure. Time. So let's back up a little bit. You corrected me when I said that, eating healthy and exercise is important for everybody, not just diabetics. And thank you. And let me clarify kind of what I meant by that. So my twin brother has a son that was diagnosed with diabetes, 7-8 years ago when he was about 12 or something. And one of in some ways, so the standard American diet, the standard American diet, if people are eating processed foods all the time and they're not diabetic, if they're eating processed foods all the time, they're eating junk food, they're eating crap, they are spiking their insulin, probably spiking their glucose, possibly not. It might not show up on a diabetes test like that. But the reality of it is they are taxing their pancreas, period. So, and of course, insulin is made in the pancreas. So eventually, whereas a type 1 diabetic that monitors their glucose all the time, they realize that because they're checking their glucose. So they realize what's going on with everything they eat. Whereas the standard American diet person that's eating processed foods and doesn't check their glucose as regularly like a type 1 diabetic, they don't know what's happening to their blood sugars or their insulin levels. So, but their pancreas is being taxed, period. And you got a lot of issues with insulin resistance also. But so a lot of times those are pre-diabetics, and they get diagnosed as pre-diabetics later on in their life when they're in their 30s or something like that. I don't know if I really believe in the term pre-diabetes, because you either have it or you don't have it. And I think sometimes the pre-diabetes word is a way for healthcare practitioners to say, oh, you're kind of on your way, but you're just barely there. You might want to make some changes. But in my opinion, pre-diabetes means, like borderline diabetes means borderline control. So can you expand on pre-diabetes and, what's going to happen in the future when you do get a diagnosis like that, and just kind of expand on just, what I expressed just a little bit ago? Can you expand on that?
Yeah, I will. I am going to ask first, if you've used the word a few times, and it is a sensitive word with me, by what you mean by control. How do you define that?
That's a great question, and I'm glad you asked that, because I think no matter who you go to, here's one thing that I've heard about. So my nephew, I can give you just personal examples of my nephew. When they talked about controlling his diabetes, they wanted him to have an average blood glucose of 150 or less, or 150, between 150 or 200. And my brother asked at the time, it's like, well, what is normal? What's a normal blood glucose? Well, 100, 120. He goes, well, we're going to shoot for that. And they told him no. And they said, no, you don't want to do that. And he's like, well, no, I do. I want my son to be, I want my son to be optimal. So, and he was testing his blood glucose 50 times a day. He was a competitive wrestler, and, especially during those times of intense activity, he would have to monitor his blood glucose 50 times a day to kind of find out what exercise would do, what insulin would do, and what certain foods would do. That's kind of the only way. So to control it was to control a blood glucose and keep an average blood glucose at a certain number. That's, I think, traditionally in the healthcare system, how we define control. But it sounds like you have some other ideas. So I would love for you to express those.
So I like that you use the word optimal. So, and it's interesting because when you talk about a dynamic with a parent and a child, you as a parent, I have 2 children. I have a almost 17-year-old and a newly 13-year-old, though she's been there for a few years. But anyway, You are scaffolding your kids, right? You're giving them the tools so that when they launch, they have what they need to launch. And it's really no different with diabetes, but there's definitely a magnifying glass, and there's so much more immediate consequences. And then the weight of what you're doing is going to be a long-term complication for your children. So I am not a mother of a child living with diabetes, and I feel they all deserve some level of badge of awards for what they're dealing with, as any parent who's taking care of a child with a chronic illness. But it sounds to me from what you said that your nephew values the sport of wrestling. So he was motivated under that capacity. Is that accurate? And then you discussed that your brother had his own goals he was optimizing for. That made him feel he was providing health and an environment for his son that was optimal. Correct. So when I think of control, I think as though you are able to, I think often when people talk about control with diabetes, they think they're controlling the things that nobody wants with diabetes, which is either a low blood sugar or complications down the road. And yes, science and research studies showed that when people spend more time in optimal range, that there are less instances of the complications, but there is absolutely no certainty in that belief. And often people with diabetes are living behind this illusion of certainty that if they do this, that they will not get this. And I approach it differently. I approach it, what is important to you, what quality of life is important to you. If you want to extinguish your resources on getting that optimal range at a lot of costs of your relationships or your time or your cognitive energy I have a lot of friends who will do a lot of microdosing, and they are just looking to be in that optimal range at all costs. And what I notice often is there's a cost no matter what with what you're doing with your cognitive energy. So with control, I tend not to use that word. I tend to say it's important for you to spend time in target. That's how you define health. That's what works for you. I encourage my clients to figure out what works for them, because there's an entire whole other population of people that feel 83 is a good blood sugar. And there's a lot of parents that wouldn't want their children to be that close to a low blood sugar event. Mm-hmm. So optimal is also kind of an individual thing, like whether wheat works for you or wheat doesn't work for you. If you're gonna get bloated every time you eat it, maybe you don't want it. If you're sitting at 83 and you're having 7 low blood sugars a day, your optimal might be 150 to 200 for where you are. So it's a really dynamic number. I just wrote about this recently in a blog. I was on day 3 of a 6-day multi-day running event in the Alps, and I had perfect blood sugars all night. But what that required is I depleted my insulin at night. I didn't want to get up and eat, so I really restricted my insulin to keep it in target so I wouldn't go low. But I didn't want to get up and eat. And when really what I needed on a 6-day event is I was needing probably to have more replenishment of carbohydrates. So I'm giving a lot of words around when you talk about testing. And when you talk about control, the framework in the dialogue is as though you're out of control or in control, you're good or bad, you're passing, you're failing. Right. And I just tend to look at it as it's just a number. It's like how fast are you going in a car? Are you going 85? Do I need to look for cops? Are you going 55? I'm too slow for traffic. It's not safe anymore. It's just information. You take that information and you make a decision. And that information cannot just be a number. It can be how you feel. Where are you coming from? Where are you going? What activity are you doing? How's your hydration? Did you sleep well last night? Are things responding? I mean, there's so many elements, and you only want to take on what you can cognitively digest at the time. But for the example that you used with your brother and his son, I'm trained in this collaborative problem-solving solutions technique where you really work with people and listen to what their concerns are, and you have an opportunity to voice yours, and then you co-create a plan together. And that's what I really encourage families to do with people living with diabetes, especially when they get to the teen years and the kids are really wanting to have a larger voice. In those teen years, it starts to show that interaction and that relationship with the parent and the child, because if control was valued, then there's a point they want control. But if empowerment and information is used, then they'll continue to use those tools throughout their life. And that's where, I got diabetes at 17. But my parents raised me with that framework of being informed. What are your resources? Empowering me. And I'm very grateful, very grateful.
I love that. That's great advice. Thank you for that, Terra. That's really, really good advice. So back on the topic of pre-diabetes.
I didn't answer your question today.
Yeah, no, you did. You answered it. And it was kind of a two-part question because, there's a lot going on there. So back on the topic of pre-diabetes, I kind of mentioned that I don't like that term. And I think one of the things is I think one of the problems with pre-diabetes is we've had guests on our show that, we had one guy that struggled with weight loss and, morbidly obese and had to have bariatric surgery, weighed over 700 pounds. And it's a great story. We're following him now. He's lost over 170 pounds. Wow. And he's doing much better. One of the reasons his insurance company would not pay for the bariatric surgery at first was because his numbers didn't qualify. So they were checking his blood sugar. They were checking his blood glucose, and he didn't qualify as a diabetic yet. So he wasn't on any medication for diabetes. But I really can't imagine that he didn't have high insulin levels and probably extreme high insulin levels and extreme insulin resistance. So, I'm going to guess he might have been pre-diabetic. I don't know how they diagnose him at all with that, but can you expand on that? I mean, are we missing something when all we're doing with diabetes is the way it gets diagnosed and usually the way it gets monitored is blood glucose? Are we missing something?
I think so. So you touched on many things. So it's a threshold, and there's been policies and procedures set around it because it deals with money and reimbursement and health insurance. And so at some point they have to put when there's a threshold, and research studies that they've done have created this numeric range to where, okay, inside and outside of this threshold, we will or we will not reimburse. Every insurance policy company is different. When I work with my clients, I absolutely empower them to be their own advocate. I got one insulin pump covered at 100% 30 days after I had an insurance company pay for one. So become your own advocate. You don't know what you're going to get unless you ask for it. You bring your own case to it. And there's all sorts of ways to do that. And the system's been set up so they spend less money. But if in your client's case, this man, I mean, this was going to save in long term the insurance company. So that's him being his own advocate in that situation. It's unfortunate, but that's his own advocate. On the topic of prediabetes, type 2 diabetes, it's actually no different than type 1 in the way that you need to meet a patient with what's important to them. Now, if crossing over a threshold of some sort is going to give people an aha moment, a wake-up call, they've known that their lifestyle has been maybe not in line with what they really do value, which perhaps is health, then that's them, that crossing that threshold might give them that internal motivation to start making some changes. So as far as calling, I mean, it's funny, my father now, 30 years later, a lot of there's 7 kids, there's 6 siblings, and most of them have an element of diabetes and type 2 diabetes, and he's constantly getting checked and feeling he's good or bad, or he's winning or not winning if he hasn't crossed that threshold. And he'll be, I actually don't know it off the top of my head. I think it's 120 to when you get diagnosed with type 2. I think he's gotten close, but for him, it's literally a number in a moment of time where he feels he does or he doesn't. He's being determined if he's good or in bad health. Well, anytime you're edging up to that threshold, that's information to show you. So it's, what are you willing to see with the information you've been given? And one metric that you mentioned that I don't think is available, and I think it would be really astounding to see, is if we could measure people's insulin production. Because you can be, I did a paper, I have a chemistry degree, and I did a paper in college around glucose and aging. And glucose is almost a symptom of your insulin. Is your insulin adequately or inadequately producing to meet the needs of your body? But there are a lot of complications due to high levels of insulin. I mean, that's what type 2 diabetes is. is you're having these super high quantity, but not a good quality of insulin that you're producing. So you can do some lifestyle interventions to help give a better quality to your insulin. You can take medications, some oral medications. There's lots of interventions that you could utilize to change that for yourself. But the actual production of insulin, I mean, I'm fortunate because I get a total daily dose on the insulin pump that I use. So I can see, I just looked at it this morning and I noticed these last 3 or 4 days, I've probably gone up about like 25%. I also went to Trader Joe's and I got some holiday cookies. So it's like, okay, that makes sense because my kids and I have been having tea with our nightly advent calendar book, and that made sense. But so that number gave me a check-in. It's like, okay, is this what I run right now? Am I okay with where I'm trending? So I do an internal check-in with what my goals are. If people are going to the doctor and they're getting information that is telling them they're trending in a direction that doesn't align with who they are, they will seek out the resources that they need to adjust that. If they don't want to see that, they will hold that they haven't crossed that threshold. So when they're ready, they're going to see the information that they're willing to see. Now, what that means is whatever is going on in their life, that health marker hasn't been enough of a priority for them to make a change. And that's their choice as a person. Health commercials, magazines, doctors can tell them what they want. And unfortunately, often what happens with behavior change is that people are going to stand more strong in the way that they are choosing if someone's telling them to do different until they decide themselves. So
wow,
it's really
powerful. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
very individual.
It's very individual. I'm fortunate in the health coaching training I've received. They talk about bioindividuality and how one person's food is another person's poison. And it's true. I mean, you go to a dinner party, especially in California when pre-COVID, because that's not happening now anyway. There's not a person at the table that's eating the same way that they think is optimal. Some people are eggs, some people are no dairy, some people are no wheat, no GM. I mean, it is all over the board. Right. And that's great if that's working for them, you know? Right. I mean, so it's very individual. And I start off with, you know, what does health mean to a person? What does that mean to you?
Yeah, that's important. You gotta meet them where they're at, correct?
Right.
So tell us a little bit about yourself, if you don't mind. You talked about your insulin pump. Tell us about how you talked about the nurse come in with an orange a few minutes ago, and that basically was a nurse showing you how to inject insulin into an orange with syringes, I'm guessing, correct?
Correct.
And now fast forward 30 years later and you're using an insulin pump. So an insulin pump is supposed to, and there's your insulin pump right there above your belly button, correct?
Correct.
Yep. And so tell us, you're talking about you use 25% more insulin over the last few days because you ate some cookies. So how do you control your insulin pump based on what you eat? Does it monitor your glucose? Does it monitor your glucose itself? I mean, tell us about that process.
So I currently am in a clinical trial with, and I wear an insulin pump called the Omnipod, and it utilizes the Dexcom continuous glucose monitor. So for people who aren't aware, what that is being a type 1 diabetic. And when I was 17, my body's started kind of attacking itself. It's an autoimmune disease. So it looks at my ingredients that make insulin as foreign, like it's something it needs to get rid of. So it gobbles up all the ingredients that my body needs to make insulin. So an insulin, you need to live. So in order to continue to live, I needed to inject insulin every day. It's digested as a protein, so it cannot be taken orally, although now there are some inhaled insulins available on the market. So
although they don't work very well at all.
Well, I've heard mixed. It depends on what worked means. There are some people that like it as a base to cover some postprandial spikes. So it just really will work. It depends on what you're optimizing for.
It's individual. It's just hard. So it's more difficult. I personally
have never tried them, but so 30 years ago, I started injecting insulin. I personally don't like injections. Really could be a part of diabetes. I have this whole workup I do when I have to do an injection. But with my insulin pump, I change it out every 3 days. I've been on several different insulin pumps, but it is an automated system. So it uses my continuous glucose information, and then it uses algorithms and a software. And those are what's evolving and very individual now in the diabetes industry. And there's some that are on market. This particular one is not on market. There's people, so I use a system that automates itself. I kind of just sort of exist and check in every once in a while on the information. I change out the gear, and then it continues to kind of know me. It's not perfect. It's still something that I have to manage. But in the last several years, the way that diabetes management is trending for people who use insulin is utilizing a continuous glucose monitor and some kind of software that grabs that information and then makes insulin dosing decisions. This is one product that's available there, and that's what I use. So I sort of do a check-in, like, how am I feeling? How have the last couple days been going? What's going on for me today? What do I need to know? And I make decisions accordingly. For me, I follow sort of an intermittent fasting regimen for eating right now. So I pick a window during the day. If the holidays, I kind of just enjoy time with my loved ones a little bit more, and then I find my goals and what I want moving forward, and then I'll make adjustments. So yeah, I noticed that, like, I don't look at my total daily insulin that often, but I was curious. And so I looked this morning and noticed there was a trend upward over the last 3 or 4 days.
Wow. I mean, the technology is really amazing.
It's phenomenal.
And the continuous blood glucose monitoring, I think, really has helped tremendously with and alongside with the insulin pumps, because it really, and you think about it, that's what your body does constantly. If your body's working right, if you're not a diabetic, it should be, it should be continuously your body's continuously monitoring its own glucose, and your pancreas should react by releasing insulin appropriately. And that's kind of what you're doing with that technology. That's really, really super cool. And I'm going to guess it's only going to get better over the next few years, obviously. So that's super cool. Thank you for
What I think
sharing.
is really exciting is that it's breaking into the non-diabetic space and athletes specifically, because there is when your body is optimal, like you said, your glucose trends, your glucose ranges, not just your range, but your trends with your glucose are really a window into how your metabolic system's operating. And now there's a company called Super Sapiens, and they're really marketing towards all athletes with the Abbott Libre. And to me, I just think that's beyond exciting, primarily because that is going to push the financial interest into even go further down this to make changes even faster if you can expand it so that everyone could see it. I mean, I don't know why someone wouldn't want to have that information. My son's 17 and he's playing around with some different health goals that he has, and he's curious and checks his glucose level now and then. And it's super encouraging and exciting for everybody. I mean, it's a window into everybody's health. If you are not aligned with what your health goals are, that could be a one tool for you to utilize.
Yeah, and I know some competitive bike riders that have, put on a glucose monitor for like an Ironman triathlon or something, and it just helps with them to know how they're fueling for their event. So, I never have done it. I don't know if I want to do it, because I don't know if I want to change my fueling habits, because I think I know what works, but then we don't really know what works sometimes until we monitor it. And I'm kind of a numbers guy, so I don't want to stress too much about it. But because I think I'd get kind of like you were talking about your dad, he's got that little window. That's what I would be. I think I'd be a little bit obsessed with it, and then think, oh, well, my glucose has to be here and has to be there. And, I think as you talked about this whole podcast, it's more than just a number. So although it's super cool, and I really should do it sometime. So,
well, it just really, you need to make a decision on how much cognitive energy you really want to devote to something.
Correct.
And it can be very consuming. And, I often think about the quality of life for children, and how all of a sudden there's one day where numbers are their entire reality. And that, I hope with the way that diabetes tools are evolving that can lessen that cognitive energy, even with the introduction of these systems that are using the continuous glucose monitoring information and relaying it to some software that it makes insulin dosing adjustments. I mean, as soon as I went on that technology, 30 to 40, 30% easy of the cognitive energy was lower. I mean, I got it back, I guess is what I should say, because every little decision, every little thing was kind of being taken care of by the technology. So it is really encouraging. But you bring up a really good point. Like when we talk about it's not about the numbers. Living with diabetes is a tremendous amount of decisions every day. It's not just your food. And then people often think, exercise is healthy, but it's adding another element of cognitive energy, figuring out how to make changes. You brought up earlier how your nephew checked his blood sugar 50 times a day. That's a lot of information to be making decisions around. And those are just the obvious ones versus, I go to get in my car and it's like, okay, where's my meter? Where's this? I call it my diabetes phone. And do I have snacks in the car, and where am I going, and when will I be back? And same with a trip, like how many supplies and the cognitive energy it's an aspect. I think it's kind of the unseen aspect of living with diabetes.
Yeah, and I think in today's world, and not just with diabetes, but with everything that we do, there is so much data available, and like you say, it can kind of maybe overwhelm us sometimes with all the cognitive decisions we can make on that data. So we have to make a cognitive decision on what data is important to us and what are we going to track, because if not, we can be overwhelmed quickly with all the information that's out there.
Yeah, and how to use it. Like, how do you use it? Like, what do you want? And is that all that data giving you the information? Is there a way to look at the data? One thing I think is super, super interesting is how end users created this entry into taking continuous glucose monitoring data, and they created a hacking system to be able to go in to use whatever insulin pump they were using. It's called looping. And it's just interesting that end users are creating the reality before the industry was catching up. So
that says a lot. I didn't realize that. And although I'm really not surprised, because they're the ones that are affected, and how can a pharmaceutical company or a medical device company create something for somebody when they don't know what they really want and what they really need? I mean, I get it. They do research, but I'm not surprised that the end of it that came from the bottom up, especially with that disease, because there's so, like you say, you got to decide it's more than just monitoring glucose. You got to decide what you're going to eat, what you're going to exercise, all those other decisions. So anything that they could do to decrease the amount of decisions they had to make was going to make their life easier. So I'm not really surprised. I think it's super cool. I'm not really surprised though. So,
well, what's unfortunate is you made a comment as though it was the companies, and unfortunately it's the process. I've been on automated systems since 2009. It's just getting them safe enough to bring to market, and the challenges with going through the FDA and how just little paperwork things. And then the bigger companies with more money are able to push it through faster. And it gets so political, and it's not about where the technology is. It's about so much more, just as though it's not about a number.
Right. And we could devote an entire episode to just the FDA process and trying to get things approved, for sure. Right. And it's, unfortunately, patients are the ones that suffer.
Right.
So you must have a great story about, somebody's life that you've changed that's a diabetic, and they came to you and you changed their life. Share a story with us.
Oh my goodness. It's more moments for me that stand out more than anything. Mm-hmm. And I think right now with where I am in my life, some that mean a lot to me are when mothers, I speak with mothers who they feel they can breathe deeper now, knowing that their daughter is able to go on and be a mother with kids. So it's or somebody who, I had a client about a month ago, and And she's just like, you changed my life. And it was just letting her know in this moment, she's exactly where she needed to be. And that just made her, that acceptance of herself, she couldn't stop talking about how that just gave her a breath, able to breathe deeper. So specific, I think there are more moments for me in working with clients. I have a client right now going through breast cancer, and just having someone to know that's like on her team when she needs it is what she needs right now. So as a health coach, that's kind of my role. And I hold on to the moments, with people living with diabetes and without diabetes, for my clients and my friends.
That's awesome. Well, Terra, you're definitely an inspiration, and you're definitely rocking it, and you're doing everything you can to be optimal, and you're definitely educating and empowering others to really lead their life optimally, however they want to define that. So I really appreciate you being on and helping educate and empower individuals. So thank you for doing what you do, and keep doing it.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So what's what drives you? What fires you up? What is your passion? What fires you up the most, Terra?
Being active in the outdoors.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so what's the best way for people to get a hold of you?
Visit my website, and or they can email me, Terra@betweendiabetes.com, and my website is www.betweendiabetes.com. And even anyone interested in, like I said, I'm just finishing up writing about my 30 years. I wrote a blog for each year, and in those blogs, it was really important to me that I just put out there to just give perspective around what living with diabetes, some of the challenges it brings, the day-to-day, the long-term. So I invite people to visit and look at some of those stories.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being on today, Terra. I really, really appreciate it. And I wanted to mention that I just had a conversation, some communication with Dr. Scott Jensen. Dr. Scott Jensen is a senator from Minnesota. He's been on our show before, and he is going to be on our show on December 28th. He will be on our show, and he will be talking about the new COVID-19 vaccine. It's an mRNA vaccine, and he will be talking about that vaccine. So you don't want to miss that show. It will be December 28th. I'll update you guys more on social media and on this podcast, so you don't want to miss out on that one. And again, Terra, thank you so much for being on our show. You've been listening to Health Solutions with Shawn and Janet Needham.